Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion class in the American Gothic. We're now in week 4, the Clash of Imaginary Worlds. Last week, we discussed the pleasure of the Gothic through the more general lens of the ability that literature has to disclose worlds in an isolated way. This built on a more general foundation that recognizes the human plight of remaining homeless in the world. Accepting our homelessness reminds us that everything we have, feel, and experience is temporary, especially a feeling that one is at home or that one has some amount of power or control. Relieving ourselves of the pressure to extend this time allows us to simply enjoy such moments as a blessing instead of dominating others as a way of extending it.
Is that going to drive you nuts?
A little bit. That's okay. Irving's second point was into intentionally engaging with the world by choosing an easy faith, a willingness to be deceived. This instantly opens us to embracing the definition of truth that Irving suggests through Knickerbocker, but also renders us more open to the joys of nature, literature, and the material world. Skeptics remain isolated from the smaller gifts gained by granting the impossible the benefit of the doubt. They never get to marvel or wonder at how the impossible becomes incorporated into everyday existence. Maintaining a willingness to be deceived protects us from simply falling into an ideologically oriented life. Such deceptions are interruptions of the banal, mundane, corporate, commercialized life, and they expand our sense of what we might become should we have the courage to pursue it. Does that sound familiar? This week, we'll examine Irving's most famous story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and we'll end, a little bit out of order, by examining some of his remarks about Native Americans. The goal of this is to show how Irving melds both the theoretical and the practical stakes of the Gothic. So that's what we'll be exploring today. Ready? All right, here we go. Sleepy Hollow is the second story in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon that's credited to Dietrich Knickerbocker, and it offers both a warning against reductive thinking and a warning against the tendency to dwell unthinkingly in an imaginary world. His target, I argue, is capitalism. He hopes to make readers aware of the imaginary kernel of the spectral world, showing its frightful correspondence with the Gothic. In this story, his main focus isn't the ethics of capitalism so much as it is the way that a calculative, future-oriented view of life renders one joyless and impotent. So, the first paragraph locates the setting in Tarrytown and also reminds readers of Knickerbocker's sense of truth. After telling a story about how the town got its name, Knickerbocker makes a direct address to the reader. Quote, "Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic," end quote. This declaration, which haunts most of the facts presented throughout his story, divides vouching, which is incorporating a willingness to believe as a form of appropriation, right? That's what it is to vouch for something. So he holds that against merely adverting, which is articulating a possibility that somebody else might believe. So that's the initial distinction. To vouch versus advert. And that's Knickerbocker's goal. He's not going to vouch for anything. He'll just advert it. Okay? As in Rip, Knickerbocker's precision expands truth, therefore, to include a range of options that allow one to responsibly report facts instead of assuming that truth is a given, extant, external thing. Right? As Knickerbocker adverts things, he's not claiming that they're true. He's just presenting them as possibilities. He's not going to vouch for them, right? To advert something is a smaller, it's a more humble way of expressing something as a fact than vouching for it. He's just making it known. He's narrating. Okay? In this way, Irving centers the story in a space between adverting and vouching. Its effect displaces readers from passive modes of unthinking acceptance because he's not telling it's true, right? He's just presenting it. So you can't just accept it as though it's true because it's not that kind of story. So he forbids you from just being a passive recipient of the story, and he does what he can to make the reader active, to challenge them to prolong the hesitation, which is itself a form of tarrying, that precedes either belief or disbelief. In short, this sketch starts by questioning the nature of truth beyond the clearly fictitious details of the story. Do you see where this is really about truth? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Tarrytown, according to Knickerbocker, is only a landmark for the story's titular location, Sleepy Hollow, about which Knickerbocker states, quote, a drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere, end quote. Once again, Irving juxtaposes European and indigenous folk traditions as potential causes. Quote, some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement, others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Heinrich Hudson, end quote. So you have the German, you have the Native American, and they're both juxtaposed. As with Rip Van Winkle, Irving therefore reminds readers born in America of the history that precedes European invasions. The effect, no matter the cause, is that the good people are, quote, given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions, end quote. After discussing the chief specter, the headless horseman, Knickerbocker states that the native inhabitants of the valley have a visionary propensity, but that it's also, quote, unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time, so that they begin to grow imaginative. Once again, Irving reminds readers of the importance of places. Each place has its own ability to give visions to those open to receiving them, some places perhaps being more supernaturally inclined than others, but the place itself is able to speak. And as you imbibe the air of that place, you become more receptive to the kinds of stories that it has to tell. You know, and if you think back to last week when we talked about Crayon sitting on the riverbank under the tree, it's that kind of thing, here just rendered supernaturally. Does that make sense? Okay. There's a human tendency that Irving also discusses to see the possibility of the supernatural. It's something that's important across cultures. And it's a tendency that we're in danger of forgetting in a world driven by empiricism, rationalism, and scientism. Right? Because those modes just discredit the whole possibility of the supernatural, despite its incredibly human power and the grab that it has on human imaginations. It's what lets us imagine things that we don't see directly or that we can't prove. And if we deny things that we experience that can't be proved, it's an incredibly limiting and impoverishing attack on human capacities and potentialities. And that seems to be part of what Irving's worried about, at least in this story. So, Irving then introduces Ichabod Crane as a man who desires, quote, pretty sisters or good housewives or mothers noted for the comforts of the cupboard, especially because he was, quote, a huge feeder and though lank had the dilating powers of an anaconda. Knickerbocker adds that Crane was, quote, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity who most firmly and potently believed in Cotton Mather's history of New England witchcraft, end quote. It's worth noting that Crane's credulity is one that's simple in nature. It's a term that readers can understand as a contrast with complex. The willingness to be deceived is a complex credulity. That was Crayon's mode of being, right? He had the willingness to be deceived, but that's complex. It's not something that's simple. Crayon's credulity is an active suspension of doubts rather than an eagerness to digest a tale and to render a firm and a potent belief. Does that contrast make sense? So simple credulity is always going to orient itself toward that which is firm, and therefore there's an implication of something that's potent underneath it, right? Because it's unilateral, it's one-dimensional, it's one-directional, it's not confusing, it's very, very clear. But this firm potency is something that comes out of Ichabod Crane and not from the tale itself. The contrast, again, is Crayon, who has a complex relationship with belief, who's willing to believe by being of an easy faith. That means that he's going to allow his doubts and suspicions to be overcome. To not discredit them and not to buy into things completely, but to have a very easy, open, not firm, not potent grasp on what truth is. Is this true? Why not let it be true? And you can smile and wink at it. And it's okay. There's nothing firm about Crayon's orientation toward truth. It's open, it's free, it's easy. This is very ponderous and hard and simple. When you have something complex, you can't be firm about it. There's too many angles, there's too many unknowns and variables. And so again, this is the earlier story in the book. He's already set up his kind of exemplar model, which readers of the sketchbook should therefore understand Ichabod Crane's simple, firm, potent belief as being something worthy of one's suspicion, if not ridicule. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's something desperate and controlling about Crane that becomes intimated in his type of belief. Again, as opposed to Crayon, who I think is more of a stand-in for Irving's own belief about what belief can be. The narrator's view of belief contrasts with Crane's in ways that help readers appreciate this distinction in what belief can mean. So, Knickerbocker notes that Crane's appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it had been increased by his residence in the spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow, end quote. Crane should not be confused with Knickerbocker himself, however, as the historian's appetite for the marvelous is limited to acknowledging its possibility. It remains undigested in the space between vouching and inverting, right here. In this way, Irving structures Sleepy Hollow around two contrasting possibilities: that which remains open to possibilities as such, which the narrator, Knickerbocker, presents, and that which embraces only one possibility, simply, rendering it certain, and that's what's represented by the protagonist, Crane. Because Irving's text encourages readers to dwell on possibilities and questions, it's not a surprise that Crane's story cautions readers about the dangers of conviction that cause the imagination to stop engaging in wonder. Crane's immoderate character, which merges credulity with the need to believe most firmly and potently, alters his perception of the external world in ways that he irresponsibly chooses to ignore. Again, his way of engaging the Gothic is less self-aware than Crayon's. This means that Crayon's engagement with supernatural stories creates sources of fearful pleasure that guide his interpretations of the natural world. Crane never realizes that he's involved in his interpretations, however. Thus, when walking home, quote, every sound of nature at the witching hour fluttered his excited imagination, and he saw fearful shapes and shadows that beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night, end quote. Because Crane's beliefs skip past the space between adverting and vouching, nothing of nature's own possibilities lingered as possible. His imagination instantly understood everything as though it were participating in the Gothic in a way that was true instead of a possible interpretation of reality. Okay, so Crane skips over, if Crane's here looking at nature, it's filtered by an act of interpretation that he never acknowledges, right? And so he sees everything through the lens, and it becomes scary to him. And that's how, but he doesn't see his own complicity in rendering it scary, because this is forgotten. When you look at how Crayon depicts things through a Gothic lens, it's a source of pleasure and delight. It just makes it a little more interesting and exciting. Right? To call a librarian a wizard, it's not really, you don't suspect that this person actually does magical incantations or sacrifice or anything like that. For Crayon, it's all an active mode of adding something to the world, but he's self-aware of that addition. He's self-aware of how he's narrating and reconstructing what that landscape looks like. He's doing it intentionally. Crane has no idea that he's involved in recreating the world in tune with the Gothic stories that he's swallowed. His experience then ends up reinforcing how he sees that world. He takes a simple belief, interprets nature through that. His experience of nature thus confirms the simple, firm, potent belief that he had already, but he doesn't realize, he experiences it as a confirmation, but doesn't know it's simply tautological, right? He's just using his own proof as evidence to prove it. And he's not aware of the cycle that he's caught in. Crayon, a lot more self-aware about that. And, this sounds funny because it's Sleepy Hollow, which is a charming, funny story. But when you look at other simple, firm, potent, ideologically driven statements about race, about gender, or about anything that, say, Donald Trump says. Donald Trump says a lot of simple things, and a lot of people have very firm and potent beliefs. And if you don't recognize those as framing and filtering things as an interpretation, your experience of reality seems to confirm those simple, firm, potent beliefs as true. Because that act of interpretation disappears when all you want is to be convinced that this has actual concrete truth value as an absolute truth, not a complex or contingent truth. That's one of the political implications of what I'm describing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So, Crane is always a dreamer, and Irving shows that his daytime dreams are just as misguided as his evening encounters. During the day, Crane sees reality through a calculative sensibility that extracts the possibility of profit from nearby material objects. Importantly, and that just basically means instead of seeing a forest and saying, wow, what a great forest, Crane automatically says, wow, that lumber would be great to sell. At what price? It skips over the thing that is, which is a tree, and goes instantly to a profit motive, calculating how that can be used as a resource for the making of money. That's how the capitalist mind works. That's how Ichabod Crane's mind works. Does that make sense? Okay. So this contrasts with Crane's ability, again, to endow material objects with the greatness that they may not truly deserve. Right? Shakespeare's chair might not really be Shakespeare's chair, but what Crayon adds to it to make it Shakespeare's chair ennobles the chair. What Crane adds, rather than Crayon, when he sees the woods or when he sees the farm, he adds something to it, but the filter that he adds deprives of it its own unique value. Its materiality is not important. All it is a potential profit sign. Does that distinction make sense? Okay. So, Knickerbocker notes how Crane, visiting the lands of the, quote, substantial Dutch farmer Baltus van Tassel, whose daughter Katrina was one of Crane's students of Salmody, beheld a barn full of animals, including, quote, sleek, unwieldy porkers, grunting in the repose and abundance of their pens, whence sallied forth now and then troops of sucking pigs, as if to sniff the air, as the sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare, as though his devouring mind's eye he pictured to himself a variety of feasts. For example, in the porkers, quote, he carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham. And he just goes through all the animals. I mean, do you remember reading that passage? It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite passages in the book. From pig to goose to rooster to guinea fowls, Crane folds the living and natural world, which Irving laboriously details, right? As you're reading it, you can just see this beautiful pastoral landscape. It's gorgeous. And you can visualize the beauty of that pastoral as good in itself. What Crane does, though, is shrink it into a profitable, consumable form. The animals aren't animals, they're meat waiting to be cooked. Nothing but that. So, does that way of seeing make sense, or that difference in the ways of seeing? Okay.
Well, Crayon's way is sort of a nuanced way rather than the straightforward, simple, potent way of looking at it, right?
Well, it adds, rather than subtracting from what's made, right? So either way, you have a material object that you're interpreting something, that you're interpreting through a lens. What Crayon does is take a poetic lens and ennoble the natural world around it to make it more beautiful and more magical. What Ichabod Crane does is use a lens that denies any sort of inherent worth, beauty, or agency to what is, and only pictures it in a future consumable product. And so it deprives it of its own good and only makes it something that's a potential good for him, either in terms of something he can eat or something that he can use and gain money from. Right? And so, I mean, you're right, and that one is a complex way, and one isn't. But beyond that, the ethics of how to see that way, I think, are huge. Right? I mean, it's not just, oh, you can see it this way or that way. One thing, it ennobles. It makes the world better in seeing it that way. And what Crane does is deprive it of all beauty and inherent worth and makes it soulless and empty.
Kind of like the difference between an environmentalist and a lumberjack or something.
Well, in some ways, yeah, it depends on the lumberjack and it depends on the environmentalist, right? I mean, environmentalists have their own reasons for valuing the environment that sometimes do and sometimes don't actually deal with the place that's there, right? I mean, if you have an environmentalist who lives in Washington, D.C., really working hard to save the wetlands of Louisiana, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that environmentalist really knows that place. It becomes a theoretical or ideological battle rather than something that truly honors what's there. And the lumberjack, on the other hand, has an intense and intimate familiarity with what's there. I don't know a lot of lumberjacks personally, despite my external appearance. But I would imagine that a lumberjack really has a good love of trees and an appreciation for each tree's beauty and challenge and what it offers in ways that an environmentalist
But
could.
the single-mindedness of that tree.
You got a job.
Right.
You're going to chop it down. That's your job. But in doing your job, you can also appreciate what's there in a really concrete way that an environmentalist who's battling these ideological armies and whatnot never will.
But also the question about sustainability, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that a smart lumberjack would look at it and say, well, if I cut them all down and I don't replant anything here, and I cut them all at once, then and humans have made that mistake.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the environmentalist lives somewhere, and he has used the product of the lumberjack. So,
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Again, I don't think it's quite so simple.
Mhm.
And anything that seems simple, I tend to be suspicious of because I don't want to be craning my way through life. Yeah. All right. So Irving shadows Crane's character in this way, but he then takes it a step farther by showing how Crane conceptualizes the farm through increasingly abstracted frames. The way that Crane thinks about the farm moves almost instantly from what's concretely present and there through more and more abstracted lenses that remove him from the reality itself. So, although the coquettish Katrina's heart initially enticed him to the farm, he finds himself seduced by her other qualities. Quote, his heart yearned after the damsel, which sounds like a love story, going further, who was to inherit these domains. And his imagination expanded with the idea of how they might readily be turned into cash. And the money invested in immense tracts of wildland and shingle palaces in the wilderness. End quote. He's a romantic hero. Irving supplies a series of expropriations. The woman becomes land, becomes money, becomes land, with an eventual goal, one surmises, especially given Ichabod's apathy toward natural beauty, of a great fortune. Right? He doesn't want to invest in wild tracts of land to preserve them. He's going to sell those off or market the lumber or do something, right? It's all about turning things into commodities through abstracted lenses that yield some sort of eventual profit. Baltus von Tassel sees the land differently. Irving notes that he, quote, seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piqued himself on the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived, end quote. The nature of the land itself, Knickerbocker describes as, quote, the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, end quote. Van Tassel looks around him and recognizes his home, cultivating and constructing a nourishing habitation. Crane only is tarrying there for a moment. He lacks a rooted awareness of the land's ownmost possibilities, and thus reduces it to what he can expropriate and carry away without baggage. Von Tassel makes it a home. Crane's just looking to sell, to skim off what he can and put it in a way that he can take with him to get more money and go other places to get more money. Does that difference make sense? Okay. Troubles begin with the crestfallen Crane departing, despairing from the Van Tassel house after Katrina despises his affections. The departure differs from his habitual approach to the farm. Crane leaves, quote, without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated. end quote, he's sundered from his optically engaged world of consumption, right? His heart's broken, but his heart being broken means that he knows that he's not going to get the farm, right? His dreams of profit have been vanquished. And so the way that he optically engaged through looking at what he could consume, that's been interrupted and broken, okay? He can't see the world as a world of future profits anymore. Instead, because he'd been telling ghost stories and he departs at an hour, quote, as dismal as himself. I really love Irving's writing. I mean, this is just a great phrase. Crane's other spectralized world is redoubled in its effects. Crane, attuned to the expropriation generated through vision, cannot grasp how his physical interventions with the world might alter it. Thus, before, when Crane walked home and framed in the Gothic world of stories, he would, quote, shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, unaware of the effects his materiality has on the world around him. He doesn't think of himself as a body. He's just a consuming whole. On this particular night, though, Crane remains framed wholly into a Gothic world which completely mutes his own material existence. So Ichabod's whistle is answered by a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches, and he hears a groan without crediting himself as the source, right? He can't even hear the groan as his groan. He just hears a groan as a haunted, spooky thing outside of him, when it's fairly obvious that it's his own groaning that he's encountering. His noise is answered by the appearance of the headless horseman, surrounded by a moody and dogged silence that Crane finds mysterious and appalling. So, after a chase, Crane is driven off from the land but preserved, expropriated as a lingering legend by the community of Sleepy Hollow. Fittingly, perhaps, the last that one hears of Crane is the sound of, quote, his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune through the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow years after his departure, assuming that a loitering plowboy or the old country wives be, as Knickerbocker would have it, the best judges of these matters, right? So nobody sees Ichabod Crane again, but they still hear him singing. He lingers far longer than he ever meant to in the stories of what it means to be in that place, in the same kind of legends that in the first sketch that he wrote, the author's account of himself, that's one of the legends that other young ones will come to know and become familiar with, that give that place its virtue. The actual fate of Crane is left undetermined. And in the way that he's always careful to respect the property of the marvelous, Knickerbocker notes that a curious resident, quote, came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian, a fact echoed a few paragraphs later as, quote, old country wives maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around the intervening fire. As an alternative, though, because to avert something, he doesn't want to have readers be left with only one answer, right? Because that would mean at least implicitly vouching for that one as true rather than adverting it. So he always gives a couple of different stories, whether it's the High German doctor or the Indian wizard. You know, he always wants to give multiple possibilities to keep things on the complex for the reader. So in this case, the alternative is a farmer who had visited New York and claims that, quote, Crane had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and had finally been made a justice of the 10-pound court, end quote. What's a guy like Crane do? Goes into law and then into justice. The postscript of the text provides a source for the story. Knickerbocker writes, quote, the preceding tale is given almost in the precise words in which I heard it related at a corporation meeting of the ancient city of Manhattos, at which were present many of its sagest and most illustrious burghers, end quote. The use of precise in this context recalls the ethic of the narrator explicitly stated earlier, and it serves as a point of contrast to the sage burgher at the Manhattan meeting who offers the tale. The postscript focuses on the storyteller's interpretation, though, and it's a syllogism that concludes with the fact that, quote, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to the high preferment in the state, end quote, based on combining assumptions about one of the possible fates of Crane with the type of calculating logic that leads to a certain conclusion that the storyteller is willing to vouch for. The last lines of the postscript remove all possibility of knowing anything at all that happened. When asked if the story is true, the burgher replies, quote, faith, sir, as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself, end quote. This statement cleverly advertises to the general need for faith when appropriating a story, but it stops short of vouching for its need in this particular case. I don't believe even one half of it myself. Leaves a lot of room open. It adverts the story, but there's no vouching. It requires faith, and that's the faith that Knickerbocker really wants to open readers to accepting rather than demanding. It's not a presentation of this is true, you must believe it. It's a believe it if you want, because it's kind of fun. And that's pretty consistent, I think, is through Irving's ethics as an author. Does that make sense? Okay. By contextualizing the event of narration in a, quote, corporation meeting of the ancient city of Manhattan, Irving points to the looming triumph of the specter of capital against the local ghouls who haunt individual neighborhoods. Corporations, lacking corporeality, avoid becoming corpses. Their spirits persist indefinitely. The fact that the corporation is on an island named for inhabitants who are long since displaced is a soft reminder of a possible source for the drowsy spirit of Sleepy Hollow and the unsettling question of what being a Native American actually means. Right? He just lets that linger. And now when we think of Manhattan, we don't often think of the Manhattanese people. I don't know, do you commonly? Right, yeah. But at least when Irving's writing, there's still the ghosts of those people still inhabited that place enough that he could recall it to mind. Whereas now it's just corporations. It's trade, and it's industry, and business, and stocks. And what's a stock but abstraction of the natural world that's bought and sold over a table, and not the thing itself. That's where the world's gone. And Irving seemed to recognize that that was the direction that it was heading in, somewhat presciently. Any questions about Sleepy Hollow? Does that make sense?
Very, very. One of the most powerful words that I remembered in the previous readings was when the husband wouldn't tarry with his wife. So I saw Terry Town. Well, sure.
Yeah. I like the term Terry. I'm fond of it.
I'm fond of it now too. Never thought about it much.
It's Terry, yeah.
Terry.
All right. I'll move on to the other sections on Native Americans because I think it's a good follow-up to what Sleepy Hollow does. The question of what a Native American means becomes most poignant in Irving's two sketches concerning them. Irving starts the sketch, The Traits of Indian Character, with a quote from Logan's speech. And Logan was an Indian chief who Jefferson made famous in his defense of America in his notes on the state of Virginia. Like, it was just like, oh, look how great America is. Even its natives can produce powerful rhetoric. It's somewhat ambiguous. And Jefferson's race relations were muddied at best, and he was not often at his best. In any case, he popularized Logan. Logan's very well known at the time that Irving's writing, and you still hear traces of him, through high school or whatever today. Logan says this, quote, I appeal to any white man if he ever entered Logan's cabin hungry and he gave him not to eat. If he came cold and naked and he clothed him not, end quote. From here, Irving explicitly argues that indigenous tribes are appropriate to America, stating, quote, there is something in the character and habits of the North American savage taken in connection with the scenery over which he is accustomed to range, end quote, in an effort that constitutes well-intentioned racism. Right? He's saying, oh, America's a savage country. These savages are acclimated to the type of country that it is. It's not the most politically correct way of going about making an argument, but Irving's at least kindly disposed. He becomes a lot more razor sharp further on, though. He neither naturalizes ultimately Native Americans, nor simply mourns their absence nostalgically. Instead, what Irving's essay seems poised to do is ask how to define terms such as native, savage, and civilized. The second paragraph states quite baldly that, quote, it has been the lot of the unfortunate aborigines of America in the early periods of colonization to be doubly wronged by the white men, detailing that they have been dispossessed of their hereditary possessions by mercenary and frequently wanton warfare, and their characters have been traduced by bigoted and interested writers who persecute and defame natives. Irving concludes the paragraph by stating that this was not done because they were guilty, but rather they were ignorant. But he leaves ambiguous whether the they he discusses reflect the colonists or the natives. It's a really beautifully allowed rhetorical slip. The same bitter tone begins the next paragraph. Quote, the rights of this savage have seldom been properly appreciated or respected by the white man, unquote, making it clear that the term savage more aptly fits the white man, especially given Logan's speech, which serves as the epigraph for the sketch. The majority of the sketch underscores various myths told about indigenous people and how claims against natives are a better reflection of how colonists and settlers treat the natives that they confront. Quote, the cruelty of the Indians toward their prisoners has been heightened since the colonization of the whites. The whites have too frequently set them an example of violence by burning their villages and laying waste their slender means of subsistence, and yet they wonder that savages do not show moderation and magnanimity toward those who have left them nothing but mere existence and wretchedness. End quote. Not much of a mystery. It's a very small, easily discovered mystery. In the final paragraph, Irving offers an unvarnished vision of the uncanny nature of the American Republic, one that claims to have emerged as a triumph of freedom despite perpetuating crimes. He writes, quote, the eastern tribes have long since disappeared. The forests that sheltered them have been laid low, and scarce any traces remain of them in the thickly settled states of New England, excepting here and there the Indian name of a village or a stream, end quote, which echoes Knickerbocker's discussion of the Catskill that we talked about in Rip Van Winkle. Assuming that, quote, the few hordes which still linger about the shores of Huron and Superior and the tributary streams of the Mississippi will share the fate of the tribes who once spread over the Massachusetts and Connecticut and lorded along the proud banks of the Hudson, Irving predicts that, quote, they will vanish like a vapor from the face of the earth. Their very history will be lost in forgetfulness, end quote. Sound pretty right on? Not many abundant native population. I mean, there's the settlement in Tama and Toledo that you can go visit, where the Meskwaki tribes still linger. There are a few scattered here and there. Most of the stories are not well known to American school children. It's been lost. It's been forgotten. And the huge tribes that occupy the places that aren't in the settlements, they're super gone. The result of this, Irving anticipates, is a reduction of the Native American to the status of the Gothic nightmare. Figures that inspire an unreal sense of magical awe within the American imaginary that with closer study will awaken the heavy dread of guilt. Quote, or if perchance some dubious memorial of them should survive, it may be in the romantic dreams of the poet, and to people in imagination his glades and groves, like the fauns and satyrs and sylvan deities of antiquity. But should he venture upon the dark story of their wrongs and wretchedness, should he tell how they were invaded, corrupted, despoiled, driven from their native abodes in the sepulchres of their fathers, hunted like wild beasts about the earth, and sent down with violence and butchery to the grave, posterity will either turn with horror and incredulity from the tale, or blush with indignation at the inhumanity of their forefathers. Powerful writing, not often repeated in American history books today. And it's a shame. Beginning with an invocation of the mythical denizens of the classical era, Irving summons explicit Gothic themes. A secular sanitized magic emerges through narratives of the recreation of the world in the name of efficiency and property. Casting westward expansion in light of Ichabod Crane's blend of conquest and calculation, Irving shows how, in the absence of people or material artifacts, the land itself will haunt its occupiers, perpetuating the name of a people in order to anchor a story of injustice. Iowa's still Iowa. It doesn't come from England. And if anybody thinks about why the land is Iowa, or Kansas, or Illinois, there's a story there that's waiting to be unearthed beneath the ground. And that story lingers, and that story haunts those who have an ear to listen to it. And that's part of what Irving's saying about tales of ghosts and specters that haunt land, and ways that you can listen for where injustice lurks and do something about it, to pay attention and learn and remember and research and investigate. And definitely don't repeat the habits of your forefathers who committed genocide, because that's bad news all over again. But we'll be doomed to repeat it if we don't remember that it already happened once. And that's something that Irving's lesson had gone largely ignored, and so it's been perpetuated over and over and over again by the good people of the American government. So that's that story. The story of Philip, which is the second of his sketches, echoes many of these sentiments. Irving writes, quote, in the early chronicles of these dark and melancholy times, we meet with many indications of the diseased state of the public mind. The gloom of religious abstraction and the wildness of their situation among trackless forests and savage tribes had disposed the colonists to superstitious fancies and had filled their imaginations with the frightful chimeras of witchcraft and spectrology. And again, the disease of the public mind doesn't fixate on those kinds of specific religious things as often anymore, but the same nature of the diseased public mind to fix upon boogeymen or bad guys or whatever it is has remained unchecked. And that's what's incredibly troubling about the rhetoric surrounding the presidential elections. And it's getting worse every single time we go through it. It's getting far worse and far scarier. But it's the same thing that Irving's pointing out here. It's just a different rhetoric. We live in a different time where the witchcraft is not as big of a deal as job loss in that similarly abstracted way. Anyway, going back to Irving, here he targets questions of abstraction of religion, questions of fancies and demons that are used to justify violence in ways that only those bearing the mark of Crane could appreciate. Irving echoes early American Gothic tropes that often appeared in sermons with tones that demonized indigenous tribes relative to the enlightened Christians. And again, the rhetoric of demonization, that's not in common parlance, right? Nobody's worried about demonizing other races or other figures. Now you just talk about it in Iowa City as people from Chicago, which has the same effect. It's just a different kind of language around it. It feels nicer to us, or more appropriate to a place where fewer people believe in demons. Same story though. Ultimately, the earnest quality of these two sketches, especially in contrast with the jovial, avuncular tone permeating the rest, signals Irving's horrified hatred of racist displacement of indigenous tribes. Blaming the public mind and its tendencies toward violence, Irving's sketches reorient readers to the pleasurable and the horrible consequences of magical thinking. The possibilities opened by intentionally embracing a Gothic imagination can quicken a sense of delight that banishes the mundane ordinariness of the average, infusing even the mediocre with the thrill of magic. Maintaining an easy faith and a willingness to be deceived opens a way of existing in two worlds that enriches us and protects us from becoming enfolded into the Enlightenment's simple, monolithic logic. Those who neglect the work of the imagination and the facts of history in a myopic perspective on the future are doomed, like Crane, to ultimately occupy an unreal world without suspecting their own co-creation as a cause. They forget that they themselves are participating in the world and the environment that they're creating. They think it's something done from the outside when they themselves are the cause and source of it. At an ethical level, then, the sketchbook trains readers to become responsible creators of new homes, mindful to vigilantly care for the world in its extant natural and cultural particularity. Upholding an ethic of joyful co-creation in which one ensures that one remains affected in the present as one alters the world, Irving works against models of mastery, certainty, and efficiency that serve as foundations for traditional assumptions of power. From the beginning of the book, when Irving reverses old and new worlds, to a conclusion where he reverses cultural connotations of a term like civilized, Irving discloses the double standard Americans have when considering Native Americans, and this is a double standard that persists definitely into the 21st century. And the way that violence against natives is still legal and allowed in absolutely horrible ways. It reminds readers that their appropriation of land comes at the expense of human lives and natural beauties. I mean, look at suburbia as it grows. You can call it North Liberty or Coralville, but the natural beauty of the land is disappearing rapidly under a sea of concrete and Applebee's and other chain restaurants. I mean, there's very little that's glorious, unless you can look at it through Gothic lens and see the beauty of it, but that's even hard to do at Applebee's. Not a lot of Gothic splendor there. Advocating a life of dwelling, punctuated by refreshing rambles that provide reminders of the greater context of the world, Irving's Gothic promotes a potent but under-acknowledged ethical perspective that remains relevant to 21st century readers. Okay. Any questions about that? Do you understand the space of suspicion that emerges out from the writings? Does that make sense? In the way that the story is framed, the way that the sketches line up? I mean, does all of that make sense?
How does, well, I mean, the lens going all the way through the book, how does it change for the Christmas stories then? I mean, is he He's just describing fond memories?
Yeah.
Okay.
And because his way of thinking, it allows for beauty. I mean, I think that's something Irving's really intent on, is helping readers see the potential for joy and beauty and wonder and magic and delight on the one hand, but he's also able to use that same awareness of how we interpret reality to castigate this type of consuming capitalist mindset and understand the full horror of the terrors that it perpetuates unthinkingly. Literally unthinkingly, because those who are gripped by that mindset don't realize that there are other options. It's a simple, firm, potent way of understanding the world. And it's hard to shake people from that unless you give them a lot of warmth and joy and beauty and magic. And once they delight in it, then you can flip the switch and say, here's the flip side. Just as unreal, far scarier. Because it's real scary, not story scary. Real damage gets done, not Gothic damage. Real humans are killed, not fictional protagonists. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah.
When did he first go to Europe?
1815, I think.
Do you think it scared him? I mean, do you think he saw what Dickens was seeing, that there's just this?
I don't think that that's the trip that he took.
Okay.
You know, I mean, from what I've read about him, I think that he was really intent on figuring out what it means to be an American writer. What does America have to offer? What is the old world? Well, I mean, for Irving, the old world's the one he left behind. It's America. The new world's Britain. It's an exciting adventure, and he's able to recover not Dickens' London, but Shakespeare's Stratford-upon-Avon, right?
Yeah.
You know, the places that he's looking into aren't the urban, decayed centers. You know, he's really looking at how to look at Europe through a more delightful lens, in a lens that only an American can provide. You know, he's making a case for American literature as he's writing, even as he's writing in Europe for the bulk of at least the sketchbook. So, I mean, I don't think he saw the same things. I don't think he had the same intentions, but I do think that what Dickens was doing as an author and what Irving was doing as an author have a similar ethical drive behind them.
Okay.
They're just taking different ways of exposing what's unthought by a lot of society and making it a lot more prevalent, allowing it to manifest a lot more strongly. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I did not know this part about him, and he's so contemporary now. I actually had to think Teddy Roosevelt and his fight to preserve natural wonders that he have enjoyed this literature.
I don't know that Roosevelt would have had much of an eye for it. I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know.
You'd like to hope so. You'd like to hope that anybody who reads this book will become ennobled by it.
Yeah.
You know, I want to think of it as the kind of book that just reading it makes you a better person.
Or at least capture the humor in it too.
Yeah. Because it is funny. Because life's joyful and it's good to laugh. You know, and it's tragic and it's good to cry. And that whole range of human emotion and experience is something he's willing to capture in different ways.
Well, I had an experience this week. I mean, I'm not trying to get overly political, but when I was reading the Indian section about when the tent or the teepees and stuff were set on fire, and then when they ran out, they were slaughtered.
Yeah.
On Democracy Now!, at the same time that I was reading this, they were talking about the hospital that we hit over in the Middle East, and the Doctors Without Borders. They had a couple of them on there, and they said the doctors and some of the patients were coming out of the building and getting slaughtered. The exact same thing.
It's an effective military strategy.
Right.
It works every time. Yeah.
Astonishing.
But wasn't that an accident?
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Was today's class helpful?
very enjoyable.
Good.